Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, sir. Can you start the last right now?
Oh, should I start my lecture?
Yes.
Oh, I thought there was an introduction. What's going on? Well, are students connected? Is it live? Is it recorded? What is going on? Can you please clarify what is going on? Because I don't understand what's going on. Usually I get an introduction, then I speak, but here I like talking to the void.
Hello, so it's live now, so you can start now.
All right, okay.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so thank you very much. I will share my screen and see, please can I confirm that you can see my screen? Just a minute. Here we go. All right. So can I see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be part of this lecture series of the University of Economics of Ho Chi Minh Cities, in particular of the business school. And I'm very happy because we just completed a project together that will allow our students to study in the two university exchange students. It is a project that has just started and of course is based on a particular area, which is architecture and urbanism. And I teach at the School of Architecture and Planning, as you can probably imagine, you probably heard from or read from the announcement, is the School of Architecture and Planning of the University of Auckland. It's one of the 3 schools of architecture in New Zealand. Actually, we have others, but those are the 3. There are 3, actually 4 now, because another school has been added 2 years ago and is at the very beginning now. And we are, of course, the leading university in the country, and very glad to open this collaboration with foreign universities, in particular in Vietnam, in particular Ho Chi Minh City, because we strongly believe in the capacity of, let's call it the Pacific Rim area, to collaborate and be able to develop together ways of addressing the big challenges that our future is deserving for us. Now, as you can see from the screen, I will be talking about a particular area, which is what is happening to the city. I call it planetary urbanism. So the urbanism of the scale of the planet. So the planet Earth, of course, is an idea of generalized urbanization. So urbanization everywhere. Cities are no longer just inside a wall, but cities are everywhere. And also what we used to understand the opposite of city, which is the countryside, more and more becomes part of the city in one way or another, either because it gets englobated into the city or because it gets connected directly to the activities of the city. Now, what I will be talking about in particular is something that has to do with a particular notion of the city and a particular component of this particular city, which is our planet. And I'm talking about the commons. The commons is something that is becoming a very major element in the discussion because it has to do with exactly what is in common. I will further elaborate it in a minute. But something that we've heard in the last few weeks for the COP26 is how much we need to really take care of what is common, and in particular on our planet Earth, because we know that we are approaching an incredible challenge due to our excessive exploitation and extraction of what it is actually offered to us on Earth. And so climate change in particular, but we also have other environmental challenges that are associated with it. Now, I've been told to start with a quiz, although probably it would be very difficult to have an answer since I'm not quite sure how we can manage here on Zoom. And so my quiz is what it is in the main picture here in the center. So I was talking, my main topic would be exactly commons in particular, because I'm talking about cities or urban commons. And one of the elements that is distinctive and has a very tight and close relation to urban commons is public space. So the images that you see in this picture are actually images that you might recognize. They are actually not unfortunately, they're not from Ho Chi Minh City. I've never been there. Are pictures that I took when I went to Hanoi. Hanoi, of course, for me was an incredible, diverse experience. I'm Italian. I grew up in Europe. I studied in Europe. My experience, particularly professional and in academia, took me around the world. I taught everywhere, almost in every continent except for the Antarctica. But when I went to Vietnam, it was really, really a striking experience. And the thing that struck me more was exactly the public space. And the public space of Hanoi specifically was of my interest because one of my students is actually a doctoral student who is a professor at the University of Engineering of Hanoi, came to New Zealand to do his PhD, and he was very much interested in what is going on in the city, in the core city, the old ancient city of Hanoi. In particular, the conundrum there, so the complexity, the difficult question there is to answer is why a place like that one is so popular, is so attractive. So if you go to those typical advisors or typical books that tells you where to go and what to see, you look at Hanoi, and the first thing is the ancient quarter. But the question is that you won't be actually invited to go to the ancient quarter to see particular monuments that you do if you go to Rome, the capital city of Italy, or if you go to Paris. But you actually are invited to be in this incredibly vibrant and rich environment of the Hanoi ancient quarter. And indeed, this was a quiz. What is this? This is an incredible combination that I've never imagined it could existed of a system which is based on appropriation of spaces. So people appropriate spaces in an incredibly creative manner, as you might recognize, because you might have been in Hanoi, and I guess that Ho Chi Minh City has some corners that might be similar to this one. What you see here is a particular combination of forms of appropriation, informal, and in some cases with a specific element of illegality of the sidewalk, so the public space of the pavement that is supposed to be for the public. Now, what you see here is the extension of a store, which is probably a medicine store, and that particular part is actually, as you can see in front of it, occupied, in front of the store, is occupied by tables. Those are tables of a restaurant. And the restaurant is actually using this table only when the store is closed, because there's an agreement between the two people. But the striking thing is the kitchen of the restaurant, which is this thing here at the top of this illegal extension, which when I saw it was just an incredible appearance. I thought they were like rock stars, but in reality, they were just preparing food, and actually delicious food. So these images that you see are actually something that is very much part of the everyday culture, of the material culture of people. And as you can see, there are elements that probably allow for creativity, for capacity to interpret particular conditions, instances and conjunctures in an incredible, inventive way. So you can see this lady carrying an incredible number of pottery on her bicycle, someone, which is this image here to the right, someone preparing food on the street with the most beautiful and simple instrument and object that we can imagine, we can invent to create food. An incredibly complex, the one I described, system of multiple actors, what we would call it multiple stakeholders, and of course, the incredible dimension, human dimension in the historical architecture of Vietnam. Now, my lecture is about these particular conditions of public space. Pictures here are actually pictures that I've taken here in New Zealand, in particular places where, in reality, those things that you see were not supposed to happen when these places were planned, because these are actually shopping malls, but are shopping malls that have been somehow appropriated by people. And you can see there in the middle images, so this one here, that at night when shopping malls are closed, their car parks in particular days, not every day, are used for an incredible lively dimension of relations that, well, we never see during the everyday. So what are we doing in this talk? I will be addressing the ongoing development of the urban commons, foregrounding the impact of the transformation of the technological framework on their infrastructure, activation, and agents. I put the text, part of the text here, so you can follow it easier. I elaborate on my long-standing study on specialization of relational infrastructure, so the infrastructure that allow people to relate to each other and to relate to places. And exactly the things that I showed you, for instance, in Vietnam, are absolutely relational. So multiple users and multiple stakeholders create that specific clusters of specialities of elements or materialities. Such a study focuses on the impact of the rapid transformation of our technological framework. Technology is always at the forefront of those transformations, on the continuous growth of social inequalities and the relentless fragmentation of social and spatial fabrics of the city. So inequality is a major question, because we know that most unfortunately, what we are seeing in recent time is an increase in exactly inequality at all levels, particularly at the financial one. So you study economics, most of you are probably studying economics, and they understand exactly how this idea of reducing inequality, even from the economic perspective, is actually rapidly failing. And the question of fragmentation is a question that has to do with the city that all of a sudden loses its main characteristic of being a place of communities that are close together, are tight, of people that know each other, and more are made of people that have nothing to do with others and with even the space in which they are. Now, talking of commons, I want to make an example, because we are experiencing now, all of us, an incredible era, an incredible age, an incredible period characterized by the pandemic. And this pandemic, which is the coronavirus, the so-called COVID-19, is actually a pandemic that has a lot to do also with the way in which it has been addressed. And I want to make an example to better understand what means commons, just looking at another virus, which is particularly damaging and particularly threatening human lives, and is the poliomyelitis. So when poliomyelitis was discovered, or actually when the virus was discovered and detected, and eventually an antivirus vaccine developed, then before that, as you can see, there were an incredible number of cases and deaths. But what happened is that the man who was particularly well known, which is Jonas Salk, developed the most famous vaccine, one of the most successful vaccine. Well, he didn't decide to put any intellectual property. He didn't decide to patent it, because when he was asked who owns the patent of the vaccine, he replied, well, to the people. I would say, there is no patent. Could I patent the sun? So again, the commons prevails, is the common interest, what is something that belongs to all us and has to belong to all us, like the right to health. But what is happening with our COVID vaccine? Unfortunately, I'm talking now the West, in our cases where those big pharmaceutical companies develop vaccines, well, what has happened is that unfortunately these vaccines are under intellectual property protection. And well, this was what actually, when Joe Biden, the President of the United States, proposed to suspend, to lift at least the patent for a period of time, the answer was the protection of intellectual property is a source of innovation, and it must remain so in the future. Well, the result is that the global south has a number of people that have been vaccinated, who are being vaccinated, which is incredibly low. And we're talking of one figure in percent, while in the north, in the global north, we're talking of 70–80% of population. And that's absolutely a major problem, because this is exactly the difference between something made commons and something actually kept in private, when that particular something is vital for the common good. So what are the commons then? Commons are all the things that we collectively own. They are the opposite of property. Right? So Sorg, Mr. Sorg, and someone who studies architecture might recognize the image of this man and what he's sitting in front of, which is the Sorg Institute, which is one of the most beautiful universities ever designed and built. This is in La Jolla, in the south of California, next to San Diego, and is an splendid, a really splendid place facing the ocean. You cannot see the ocean, but it's exactly towards the sun, where the sun is. That's the main courtyard of the Sorg Institute. So they include the commons, inalienable goods, so something that cannot be sold. As culture, it's called the sell culture. Yes, of course, we can sell it in books and so on, but in reality, culture is something that belongs to everybody. Society, how can we sell societies? Nature, like planet, human life, etc., or shell values like equality, diversity. I don't think it's not for sale. However, they also include items that, as stated by Lamy in his lemma book, The Great Transformation, have been progressively protagonists of a fiction that enabled dispossession for capital accumulation needs. Labor, land, and money, which are obviously not commodities. Labor is only another name for a human activity which goes with life itself, which in its turn is not produced for sale, but for entirely different reason. Not can that activity be detached from the rest of life, be stored or mobilized. Land is only another name for nature. Now, I want just to make you notice this comment here about Oxfam. Well, one of the major things that has happened after keeping the patent is that 9 new billionaires have been created, and those are people that actually had big stakes in those pharmaceutical companies. But of course, in poor country, things have worsened dramatically. How we distinguish at this point commons and public, so public space and urban commons? Well, let's go back a little bit. So a clear distinction can be found in the definition provided in ancient Rome between res communis omnium and res publica. So the first, res communis omnium, the thing of the entire community, are those things that by their nature do not belong to anyone individually and are intended for use by everyone, citizens and non-citizens, so like the air, the waters, the sea. Res publica, on the other hand, the public thing, is a thing of the people. And the people are not just any aggregate of people, but a group of people associated around the sharing of rights and for the protection of their own interests. What is common, therefore, exists because of commoning, so making things in common. Social practices that collaboratively protect, and managing the commons. What is public, on the other hand, exists because of legislating. So, as in Roman terms, by vincum juris, the social practice of collaboratively guaranteeing common good by acknowledging through restricting commoning toward use of particular constituencies. Since the commons and the public goods belong either to community or to people, they are intrinsically relational. So a common is something that exactly is common. So intrinsically, in itself, means that has a complex system of relations. Yet, in the contemporary life world, new technology disrupt this kind of relationality, disrupting some cases we see with some positive changes by enhancing two major urban processes, now we're talking of cities. As I was saying before, with this idea, the perspective of the city being global. New technology grants social networks, communities, associations, and the like. Important degrees of freedom over space and time, instituting a real virtual continuum, the virtual, augmented, and mixed realities that severely restructure both social infrastructure, for example, central places become hybrid and mobile institutions, and practices, for instance, multimodal mediated face-to-face interaction. So we can have a face-to-face interaction using, as we're doing now, a computerized system or simply using our cell phones. But this face-to-face interaction is something that, of course, has radically changed the way in which we talk to our friends, we establish communities, we establish networks, and we keep up with what is happening in those particular communities and networks. Technology also make accessible to many, democratize, that digital augmented territorialization, specialties of the space of flow. The space of flow is exactly this space that is being created with the new technologies, in which all of a sudden I can be very much connected to something completely displaced and remote from myself, exactly because I'm using those particular devices like Zoom, like we do now. So that these particular things that back in time were only available to few leading global organizations. The diffusion of such pattern decrees the end of the traditional geographically and timely bounded social spaces. Social networks that define communities are less and less geographically bounded. So if you think probably your parents or your grandparents, they would live in a small town, in a small village, and their community was that town or that village. What is happening nowadays is that, of course, these communities are no longer that tightly related to a geographical area, to a specific space, but are actually very much displaced. And I'm Italian, and of course, I have very much lots of friends and colleagues and activities still around in Italy. Last night, for instance, I was until very late, 3 o'clock in the morning, actually, in a conference which was held in Delft, in the Netherlands, for an organization of which I am a part and a board member of that organization, which is the International Forum on Urbanism. And of course, that's a community that meets quite often. And of course, none of them is, not many of them are sitting in places close to each other. So, for instance, I'm the only board member of that organization in New Zealand, although there are some other members in New Zealand, but not living in my neighborhood, in my close proximity. So focusing on these processes, identify and describe key emerging challenges among the stakeholders of the commons to co-produce the urban spaces. What are these challenges? Those are 3 that I identified. There are probably more, but those are the 3 that I think are more important. So the first is the translocalism. So translocalism across localities, the one I just told you. So I can have a community of people that are located in different places. And that's very common, I think, especially because we're using social media and with our cell phones, we are always in contact with people in other places. Multi-associative transduction. So this is what we're doing now with Zoom. So transduction is taking across, transducere, so taking across. I'm taking across space, exactly in this lecture, using Zoom. So, and that allows spaces to be connected. All of a sudden, I am connected to space and to many spaces that are actually dislocated. Most of them probably in Vietnam. Some of them might be even in New Zealand. And then there is transculturalism. So these are the effects of the two, the fact that we are more and more dispersed and mobile, but at the same time, we are more and more connected with these transactive systems. What it makes is creating continuously new encounters between practices, cultures, and ethnicities. And that's an incredible opportunity that we have that we never had before. So various combinations of these phenomena have different disruptive effects on the traditional modes of production and stabilization of the correlational territories of cities. So cities are changing under our feet without us actually recognizing it. My study on New World Urbanism, I'm particularly looking at Australasia, Australia, and New Zealand, focus on evaluating how these particular big phenomena, macro trends, concurrently progress dispossession and empowerment. So on one end, we lose the ownership of our place, but at the same time, we have an incredible power that we never had before. So this is the dispossession and empowerment that act at the same time. And this is happening in a way that creates new communities, a new form of community that reframe the discourse of inequality, difference, and pluralism. Such engagement is led by various arrangements of opposing forces of domination and enfranchisement. Dominating forces operate against commoning. They are led by actants. The example that I made of the big pharmaceutical companies with the vaccine is probably not necessarily connected to cities, but gives you a clear sense of what the difference between property and commoning. And they are led by actants aiming to expand the system through enclosures, property, that deterritorialize and reterritorialize external domains with patterns of hierarchical relations of antagonism, both internal and external. So now, if the example of the vaccine is probably not very clear, I can make an example of a shopping environment. So shopping environment, a very famous, one of the probably most famous architects of the last 50 years, Rancolas, in a very famous book, which is the Harvard Guide for Shopping, wrote that shopping is probably one of the few public activity remaining. Now, what is happening is that one of these few public activity remaining is becoming more and more privatized. And in places like the one in which I live, New Zealand, but also North America, but also Australia and other parts of the world, well, these places are actually enclosed in big things that we call shopping and entertainment center that becomes more and more introverted, more and more exclusive, more and more dissociated from their own environments. And this is exactly here, this idea of deterritorialize. So disestablish a territory in which there was a community, fragmenting it, putting it these big boxes that all of a sudden completely financialize our system of relation. To be part of this society, we have to pay, we have to be, and instead of being citizens, we become customers. But on the other hand, there is an enfranchisement. So there are enfranchising forces that intervene by commoning through the establishment of forms of reasonable collaboration and co-production of actants aiming to reappropriate their own space by affirming the deterritorialization with open spheres of agonistic pluralism, where equality is a functional exchange, often conflictual, between irreducible diversity of the actants. So what I'm saying here is that in a condition in which we have such a diversity and pluralism, what we need to look is not at finding the way of being all in one way or another on the same page. We all share the same values. So some values are absolutely not reducible, not concedable. What we can do is, on the opposite, to find a way of utilizing productively or actually positively forms of exchange, form of conflict. So instead of conflict being destructive, so destroy things, conflict can be productive and lead to cross-fertilization, to new inventions, to much more, prosperity that we would have otherwise. I cautiously affirmatively interpret the capacity of the content of amorphosis or urban commons and private space to support communities to overcome social and spatial fragmentation by making their network able to reassemble the resources. As I was saying before, there is this contrast between the positive and negative aspects of the transformation, but I'm very interested in looking at what are the new potentials and leave the criticism in the background or as actually as an underpinning argument to really understand how we can, as designers, urbanists, architects, think of ways of transforming the world in which we are, starting from our action as professionals, but in reality, as in first place, let's call them citizens. So fostered by technology-enhanced general mobilization, which I call universal translocalism, connectivity of what is remote, universal transduction, and the engagement with the diverse, universal transculturalism. So translocalism, transduction, and transculturalism is exactly what I introduced a minute ago. The emerging commons and public spaces have an unprecedented performative capacity. We never had those capacities in the past, and that's what we need to learn, and we need to understand better how to manage, engage with them exactly to improve the well-being of all of us. Such capacity increases the resilience of emerging communities, enabling them to cope with the growing complexity of our systems. Both their assembling systems and institutions become recombinant, adaptive, and conjunctural. so recombinant. So we can continuously recombine our systems of relation. And we know that, for instance, when we have our applications, like I don't know, what is the most popular in Vietnam, but here, for instance, one of the most popular is WhatsApp, we can continuously recombine our friends in new groups and create new communities. But at the same time, they're adaptive because in many cases, I can select people around me with some particular functions of these applications. So when I arrive in a particular place, I establish a new network using the very same application that allowed me to establish my network in a previous in a different place. And young people know perfectly what I'm referring to. Now, what I'm talking about conjuncturally is that because this is very specific to a particular conjunction, intersection of space and time. So when I go to a place, I want to see who is around me using an application. I see who is around me here and now. And this is exactly what never happened before. That's an incredible advantage that we have. So digital augmentation bestowed the capacity of the progressively translocalized urban communities to dynamically recombine and reassociate resources, tangible and intangible, that are progressively distributed and mobile. The resulting assemblages have neat and placed embodiments that continuously retorialize their domains in a hybrid way. My analysis on the emerging system of the urban common-centric space is based on assemblage theory. Assemblage theory developed originally by a French philosopher, actually a philosopher and a psychoanalyst, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, that has been at the center of a particular area of investigation on urban issues for quite a while. So their books started being popular, in particular in the English-speaking environment, say around the end of last century. So this theory enables to disentangle the distributed and variable concatenations of heterogeneous elements by breaking them down into three core components. So if I want to break down a particular community on Instagram, for example, I can start looking at its concrete elements that are associated in various concatenations and form the common basic infrastructure and establish the social, spatial, and concept cognitive centrality. In a way, when I create this group on Instagram, in this case, I'm saying WhatsApp, I create a sort of common, right? No matter if the platform that you're using, which is WhatsApp, is definitely not common, but belongs to a big conglomerate, which is actually the so-called group led by Facebook, for the alphabet. These concrete elements are very diverse as they include material things, values and paradigms, personalities and spheres of thought that constitute both the tangible and intangible structure of the social space. Like, for instance, people that are part of my WhatsApp community, but also things that are part of that community, like images I put on the chat. The set of enabling relations is the second important thing that link the set that links the different components and establishes them as network concatenation to favor collaboration and sharing of resources. In this case, would be WhatsApp itself, so the platform itself. And then eventually the agents. So what actually makes this happen? What are the underpinning elements? And those are the things that catalyze their embodiment as institutions that support integration and autonomy of community. These agents include multiplicity of entities such as individuals and narratives that assemble, engage, and activate the infrastructure and networks of the commons. Focusing on the processes, identify and describe the key emerging challenges among the stakeholders of the commons to co-produce the urban space. My description of the new assemblages emphasizes their emerging role in the liberation of the collective power of appropriation and co-creation of dialogical and emancipatory mechanisms. The indications resulting from this interpretation of the novel forces of commoning and differentiation in the translocal and transductive and transcultural new ordinary, that's how I define it, the new ordinary, contribute to the discourse on territorial production for a radically democratic society and the universal right to the city. So the right to the city is something which is a core notion on the highest level urban policy, which is called the New Urban Agenda, that has been adopted by the United Nations in the milestone meeting of 2016 in Quito, Ecuador, and is a guiding document for all policies at urban levels. And the right to the city is the inspiring theory. The right to the city is the right that allows us as citizens not only to produce the city, but also making a city that in reverse produces ourselves. Now, to understand here what I'm talking about when I'm talking about public space, I better make you some examples and try to understand what this public space is. So looking around in the world, you find this kind of things. So that's genuine public space, a space that people can really appropriate, make them, and by creating that space, expanding their system of relation in terms of places, relation to other people. That is an open space in the central city of Bandung in Indonesia. Now, when we talk about public space, the major question is what is the main difference between what is private and what is public? And does it still make sense to make this difference? Yes, it makes. The only thing is that private and public is not anything that can be defined once and forever. As you can see here, maybe you can read it later on. I can make available my presentation, or in case you can stop the video if you can manage it. And this is how, in the different cases, and I'm using here in this case is a 4 major reference: Aristotle, Aryeh, Marxist feminism, and mainstream economics. How these private and public relations are actually completely different and completely changing the dimension. And again, here, another way of reading them, and how market economy and state administration completely reframe what is private and what is public. That's, as I told you, to confirm and reaffirm that public and private distinction is fundamental, but is not anything that has a definition that is permanent, but becomes more and more unstable or metastable. But for instance, now here I'm in my own private apartment. I'm here because I am actually in lockdown. In New Zealand, we are still in lockdown, at least for another few days, until the 3rd of December specifically. And of course, my private space, the private space of my home, becomes public. Well, you can see not much now because of the background, but otherwise you would see and be part of my private sphere. And you're still part of my private sphere because in one way or another, even though you see this star, the background, this is still my own space, my own environment, my own dimension. Even the sound that you see and my ability to move gives you some indication of this particular space. So, but one important thing is to start defining what is the difference between public space and public sphere. So let's look at what is public sphere first. The public sphere is includes something that includes all forms in which people communicate and exchange in public, right? All forms. In particular, now we're using a system that could be potentially used for public communication. Actually, not public because probably only people that are part of one particular group, with one particular class, a particular university, and so on, can access it. But potentially, we can put it on YouTube, and everybody can access it. So, the public sphere forms a space of heterogeneity, fundamental for civic engagement and collective deliberation. The public sphere is universal and thereby equally accessible to all individuals and spatially undifferentiated, right? So as I was saying before, if you're putting this lecture on YouTube, this lecture will be accessible to everybody who has access to internet and YouTube, and especially undifferentiated. So they will appear to each and everyone, no matter where they are located. Public space is something else. Public space is a space that grounds the public sphere in physical space. So all of a sudden, now we have this public sphere that is manifested, embodied in a particular location, including all those parts of the built and natural environment where the public have free access, such as streets, squares, and other rights of way. The space that offers a special location for conflict, cross-class association, and social change. So that's why public space is so important, because we encounter the others, the different, the foreigner, the diverse. And that's exactly what I was saying before, increasing dramatically in the last few decades, and that's actually to be taken as an opportunity, as a possibility. The space in which public access is unrestricted, so everybody can go, that is universal and thereby accessible to everybody. However, there are some issues, and the public space should be inclusive. Inclusive means for everybody. So an inclusion which is a total inclusion. Nobody should be left behind, so it's universal. Now, the term public implies the idea that these spaces are accessible to every member of the general public. They are where people from different groups, class, ethnicity, gender, and age have free access to. The image that you see is a very, say, adverse element of the public space, which is a bank bench you designed exactly to avoid some people to use it. This is something to understand yourself what it is. Public space as a space for public use. The term public in public space does not necessarily relate to ownership. The image that you see here is an image that refers to a particular movement, which was called the Occupy movement, started in New York, Wall Street. And they started from a place called Zuccotti Park, which is in reality a private park. But it's a private park which is a privately owned public space. So it is a public space that is owned by a private body. But as I was saying before, what matters is how it performs, not who is the owner. This implies that in legal terms, if a space is defined as a public space, ownership and right to access cannot be seen as obstacles to its public use. And public as available for interaction. So public places cannot legally prohibit interaction between users. Only the nature of those interactions is subject to publicly agreed regulations. And that's the difference that I highlighted in the beginning between what it is a common and what it is the public space. The image that you see here is a very famous place in Hong Kong, which is the ground level of one of the most important banks, which is the HSBC, designed by Norman Foster, one of the top architects that we have globally. And this place on the weekend is occupied by these particular people that are not there protesting, but they're just there taking advantage of the availability of this public space, which is completely privately owned, but made accessible. Now, again, what is important, I was saying before, is the question of the right to the city. The right to the city is the right to make the city, and by making it, remaking itself, or ourselves. Now, how are our cities? Our cities are looking incredibly different from, now you see on the left-hand side, a map of Rome in the Renaissance, to an abstractive representation of a city, which is a representation of a famous Italian architects group led by Andrea Branzi, and this is a group called Archism. So cities are changing dramatically, and even the way in which we access them now, using mainly our systems on our cell phone that guide us through the city, are becoming more and more like the one on the right-hand side. And of course, they are incredibly rich. This is probably one of the most famous markets in the world, which is Çatalhöyük, I think it's called, but anyway, the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul. And this is an incremental market. As you can see, it started from a very small set of objects, one and two, and then all of a sudden it dispersed and expanded itself in an incredible system that is actually extremely expanded and famous worldwide. But of course, we also have other kind of public spaces and public institutions. Just keeping the market, we see a space which is incredible. This is Hong Kong again, and this is a market, but this is a wholesale fruit and vegetable market. What you see there is actually a street that during the day is a 4-lane street. On each side there are 4 lanes. At night, lanes are only 1. You see only red cars because in Hong Kong, or mainly red cars, because in Hong Kong, people usually don't use cars, mostly use public transport, and taxis are exactly red. And as you can see, there are only using one lane because all the other lanes are used for markets. So this is again an example of how public space could be versatile, could be adaptive, could be capable of accommodating various functions in an incredible complementary, which are incredibly complementary, but at the same time capable of satisfying some specific needs. In some cases, the public spaces are fake, just designed and produced as a simulation. This is a camp which has been designed by the army in Israel to train the military, the army, to fight guerrilla, urban guerrilla. Nobody would live in those houses. Those are just for training, military training. And of course, when we look at public space, we have two different kinds of spaces. One is green. So the space which is, as you can see on the right-hand side, vegetated, green because we have green stuff, plants, grass, and so on. And then we have the gray. The gray is, because of its color, again, mainly concrete, stone, or asphalt. And they have rather different functions. Because we have positive and negative elements of public space. For instance, just taking one of them, public space allows for play and recreation, while in some cases we see that because of its organization, there's a lack of representation, just some groups are there. And of course, we have incredible institutions, we have incredible events, so we have incredible infrastructures that organize and arrange for these kind of things. So the first one is an incredible community center, which is the SESC Pompeii, designed by Dino Lombardi, an Italian architect who migrated to Brazil. This is in São Paulo, in Brazil. And this was an old industrial site, so brownfield, that was transformed in probably the most inclusive and open community center that I'm aware of. And there's an old project that is still incredibly actual and spectacularly operative. The second one is one of those effects of that event that I was mentioning before, Occupy movement, started from the Occupy Wall Street. This was the Porta del Sol in Madrid. As you can see, people started really taking possession and organizing their space. They even won one of the top awards in urban design, people designing this particular place. The third one is a vertical park. So creating a park that allows this particular in combination between the social value of public space in the city and the recreational value of green space in the city itself. Now, I don't want now to tire you too much with these particular things, but when you look at the institutional infrastructure, you find the things that have a specific value for society in reaffirming the psychological well-being, in reaffirming the civic and democratic well-being, or the cultural well-being. But the green one also has very important elements because in the green one, we go and run, for instance, in the morning in parks, and it's very important for physical well-being, but also for psychological. We go and relax ourselves when we go to a park, and social well-being, of course, because we are able to meet our friends and have a good time with them. But also in some cases, it is important for the environment, for environmental protection, but also in some cases for food production. And there are various examples. So the most obvious of those civic infrastructure can be named as the airports or in sport venues, and of course, places where we can live, work, play, and engage. And when we look at the proper public space, so the streets and squares, what we can see here are incredibly differentiated examples of how that can perform and cater for different groups. In this case, the top one is for shoppers, because that's a very important, very famous place in the center of Shanghai called Xintianding, the old French concession. And at the bottom, there is actually a place which is designed for children to play in the very center of Shanghai. And that's again, this is mainly for particular ways of using these reusing or adapting those places that are in between spaces, so streets and square or other spaces, as you can see, that usually can result from activities that are not designed for a specific performance. And then we move to the green infrastructure. And green infrastructure, we know exactly what it is, because it refers mainly to parks. And here we have parks, reserves, forests, and green corridor, etc., wetlands, and other things like sports places. Now, when we look at the particular publicness, we see different characteristics in it. And of course, we have, as I was saying before, places that are public, are owned publicly, and that perform publicly. For instance, in this case, still on Shanghai, we have very famous places, the first one being Nanjing Road, Nanjing Blue, the second one being the Bund, and the third one being the park in Pudong, the Central Park in this National Park, the second Centennial Park in Pudong. They're all absolutely owned by the public and open to the public. But of course, we have other situations, and that's kind of work, for instance, in London, in which in reality, everything looks quite public, but in reality is completely private. And as you can see in the pictures, in the center, you see a place that looks really public. On the left-hand side, you see where it is located, which is in the CBD, in the one relatively new development in a relatively central area of London. And of course, big players, you can see Citi, a Citibank, one of the top banks in the world. And on the right-hand side, well, you see that this is not the police, this is private security of Canary Wharf, which is exactly the place. And make sure that people behave according to some particular rules, defined by the owner of this particular place. And then, of course, we have places in which there's a sort of hybridness, in which the ownership, in this case, for instance, is what we call BID, so the Business Improvement District. The land is owned by the public, but in reality, there is an organization of businesses that manages it. And so public ownership, private management, and of course, there is a sort of ambivalent condition in which not everything is actually public. So that's something that summarizes it. And of course, we looking at conditions in which the public becomes completely privatized and simulated, like this place, which is a casino located in Macau, but is actually replicating a casino maybe in Las Vegas. And this casino is called the Venetian. And indeed, what you see here are typical elements that you find in Venice, Italy, including the boat, which is the most distinctive boat that you can find in that particular place. The water canal, which is another important thing that you find in Venice, and also some particular buildings that are actually copied from Venice. This is the Sospara bridges, this is the Tower of the Moorish with the clock, etc. But these are actually particular places that are pseudo-public, so that this one here looks like public, it's totally private. But they're also semi-public or public, quasi-public, like this square here in front of this building, which is one of the most important and famous modern building, which is the Sigran building designed by Mies van der Rohe. So this place in front of it is actually a public space. So when the developer developed the area, made a deal with the local administration and essentially released this land to public use, the land in front of the building, and in exchange for the relaxation of some of their regulations. So essentially, he could build more surface area on that particular land by releasing that particular place. And then we have some other public spaces that are in reality public, but no people cannot reach. People cannot reach them because they are enclosed in private spaces, like, for instance, green areas within gated communities. Now, that has to do with things that, of course, are very much to do with planning and regulation, with ownership and governance, as we said before. And what we see is that, of course, in those particular places, we start identify one particular question, which is how community loses its cohesion, the capacity to really constitute community. So how the public is now made by people that actually have not much to do with each other. And yes, they live in the same space, but they have very little to do. And that's where we need to really understand what is happening, because in those places, we see people, that's Jeff Burrell, a criminologist, a professor in the US, who actually on purpose trespasses some particular questions, some particular conditions that are very specific to those places in particular. Here, he's drinking beer in a place and rode a bike in a place in which he was not supposed to ride by bike, was not supposed to drink alcohol, and of course was not supposed even to sit on the green space of this particular place. The second image is being an image of the most important, or probably the most successful, one of the most large, one of the largest shopping malls in the US, which is the Mall of America. And this particular mall, in a particular moment, and we know because a few years ago there were a series of similar protests, but this was in 2014, was occupied by people protesting for some particular racial issues that are quite strong in the US. And what happened is that some of these people were arrested, some of these people were deported, and these places that in reality are, in theory, public spaces show how their publicness is absolutely negated. Now, this is, I guess, a way in which we have to look critically at the places around us, because it is not necessarily that just because we can afford to go to a Starbucks and sit on those comfortable places, or we can afford to go to those beautiful shopping malls and buy their services, that this is an inclusive place. Not at all. Those are places that we have to absolutely look with a very critical eye and understand how our role, as I was saying before, as citizens in first place and then as professionals, this can lead to a more critical way in which probably we can be better members of our society and improve our society. Now, something that before finish I want to highlight is how this can be important in order to lead our practice, our intervention, our whatever it is, career in this area. So making difference is not just making differences or making revolutions. And making a difference, as I was showing before at the very beginning with those small images that I put closer to that incredible, I want just to go back to it because that was really, for me, an incredible experience. So that at the very beginning when I showed the images on Vietnam. So you can make an incredible difference and create comfort to people with the most simple and beautiful object that you can use, in this case, for instance, to prepare some food or to create some particular opportunities. Like, for instance, I remember in Vietnam, there was this particular common practice of creating tea stalls or places where people could drink tea on the sidewalk. And these were incredibly rich places of engagement, interaction, and cross-cultural transformations. So what can we do, as I told you? So what is important is, in reality, to make differences at all scales. We can make a difference at the policies. I mentioned before, policies that range from the transnational policies like the New Urban Agenda, which is the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals that were set by the United Nations. And of course, all the countries, 164, I think, have approved it. And of course, now it's trickling down into the policies at the scale of our nations, our cities, and of course, our small local borough. But also we can make small changes in our daily life with small actions. And design is a very crucial one. So the fact that our university, University of Auckland, is the #1 university in the world for sustainability is exactly because we are particularly concerned and aware of this function that we have as designers. And when we teach design, we not just teach students to do beautiful things, but we try to teach them responsibility, and we prepare them for those big changes that I was mentioning at the beginning, are completely reframing, reorganizing, and dramatically restructuring the world in which we are. So what we're doing at the University of Auckland is preparing actually our students for the future, a future that, of course, is very threatening for the reason that we know, but at the same time opens up to incredible opportunities to be better citizens and live more prosperous world. So that is it for me today. Thank you very much. And I'm happy, please reach out. I'm happy to reply to any question if you want to learn more, or maybe just simply find some of my writings in this particular area. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy that we had this opportunity to talk to each other, and I hope to see you soon again, maybe here in New Zealand. Thank you very much, and have a good morning. A good Saturday.